In September of 1862, Robert E. Lee, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, made a daring invasion of the North. For 2 years, the Civil War raged on, and with the coming of the end of the second year, it was vital to make a striking blow to the North, and especially the Army of the Potomac. President Lincoln turned to the commander of the Army of the Potomac, at the time, George B. McClellan, and ordered him to throw Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia out of Maryland, especially since it was moving north of the capital. Lee, with 55,000 men, began to make his way through Maryland. His objective is to seize supplies from military caches and hopefully raise volunteers from the border state. But McClellan, with now 102,000 men, began to pursue, engaging with elements of Lee's army at Mile Hill, Harper's Ferry, Crampton's Gap, and winning a victory against Lee at South Mountain on September 14th, 1862, pushing the rebel forces back. McClellan's force was made up of the 1st Corps, commanded by Fighting Joe Hooker, the 2nd, commanded by Edwin Bull Sumner, the 5th, commanded by Fitz-John Porter, the 6th Corps under William B. Franklin, the 9th under Ambrose Burnside, and the 12th, commanded by Joseph Mansfield, with General Alfred Pleasonton's cavalry in reserve. Lee's army was made up of James Longstreet, commanding the right wing of the Army of Northern Virginia, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, commanding the left wing of the army, with the cavalry division of Jeb Stuart in reserve. Now, when we discuss the Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg, there's 3 general phases that go through our minds: the morning, afternoon, and evening phases. On the morning of September 17th, at 5:30 a.m., Joe Hooker's corps began to advance towards a plateau where a small German chapel, the Dunkers Church, rested. Over 8,000 men were advancing to engage with the defensively positioned 7,000 men of Stonewall Jackson's wing. Slowly, the Union troops advanced out of the woods, the East Woods, moving into the cornfield. Abner Doubleday led his division from the right, George Meade led his division from the center, and James Ricketts' division on the left. As the Confederates saw the upcoming boys in blue, artillery hell began. Back and forth, Union and Confederate artillery dueled to devastating accuracy, shredding the ranks of infantry on both sides and causing more casualties as the morning continued. Hooker, however, from his high position, was able to see the glisten of bayonets in the cornfield. He directed artillery to fire into the field, ripping up the regiments in position. However, this did nothing to stop what was about to begin. The two sides collided in a violent hand-to-hand combat, beating one another with rifle butts and fists, some even firing point-blank into one another due to the thickness of the corn stalks and lack of vision across the cornfield. The Federal troops slowly began to push the Confederates out, but Lee, in the nick of time at 7 o'clock a.m., dumped reserves who had just arrived from Harper's Ferry down to begin to push back the Northerners. The action had become so violent, the 12th Massachusetts, for example, would suffer 67% casualties as a result of the fighting in the cornfield. As more Confederate troops began to flood into the West Wood to protect Jackson's right flank, Hooker had now sustained over 2,500 casualties, and the number was still rising. He requested Mansfield to move forward with the 12th Corps. Now, unlike his corps, which had far more veteran troops, Mansfield was made up of mainly raw and new recruits. Mansfield himself was somewhat of a new corps commander, so instead of following the strategies of his fellow commanders, he had his corps march in columns into the East Woods. And those columns were mighty fine targets for artillery. As a Confederate artilleryman would say, almost as good a target as Barnes. As the fighting began, Mansfield himself would be wounded, later to die, and would be replaced by General Alpheus Williams. General George Shears Greene, commanding one of the divisions in the 12th Corps, struck hard into the Confederate General McRae's troops near the Smoketown Road, causing a confusion and rout of their forces. Greene then successfully pushed towards the Dunkirk Church, taking the ground Hooker originally had wanted to take. Hooker himself was trying to reform his First Corps, which had been scattered in the fighting earlier in the morning, and was trying to organize them to keep the push until he himself took a bullet to the foot. Now 2 corps commanders were wounded, and the First Corps was placed under command of General George Gordon Meade. In the West Woods near the Dunkirk Church, Confederates began to open up into Greene's division, finally forcing them to withdraw from the position. McClellan, however, seeing the success, did not want to lose the momentum, and directed Edwin Sumner to send men of the Second Corps to reinforce the now tactless fighting that was continuing. At 7:20 a.m., Sedgwick and French's divisions began to make their way towards the East Woods, with the hope of pushing Confederates out and south towards the Ninth Corps and General Burnside. French, however, went missing in the march and chaos, and no one had any ideas where he had gone. But something went wrong, and around 9 o'clock a.m., Sumner, with Sedgwick, attempted to direct the attack personally. That would only end with Sedgwick wounded, his division outflanked, and Sumner seen as completely incompetent. Large fighting would come to a halt around 9:30 a.m., though around 10 o'clock a.m., 2 regiments made one final attack towards the Confederates, only to be repulsed by the men of General John G. Walker's division, and that would bring an end to the morning stage and fighting on the north side of the field. At the end, no land was taken, and in the 5 hours of combat that occurred, 2 Union Corps commanders were wounded, and there were 13,000 casualties on both sides. Sumner's aide and son had found French's division of the Second Corps that had gone missing, and directed them to strike at Longstreet's wing. Longstreet's position was clearly weaker, especially since thousands of men were being dumped into the northern fight near the cornfield and East Woods. But something Sumner had not accounted for was where the Confederates were, and the kind of position they were currently holding. The Confederates under General D.H. Hill, only 2,500 men, had found their way into a road that after years of wagon traffic had become a large trench that set on a rising ridge. At 9:30 a.m., as fighting on the north ended, French began his first attacks on this sunken road, sending brigade after brigade to assault the position. In less than an hour, French's division of 5,700 men had lost 1,750 men, making his assault on the position. Lee, seeing where the new attacks were beginning, sent in his last support, commanded by General Richard H. Anderson, and 3,400 men to bolster the position and begin for the oncoming assaults. But General Sumner sent his final division, commanded by General Israel Richardson, of about 4,000 men, to assist in the storming of the sunken road. With their green flags waving, General Thomas Marr led his brigade, the Irish Brigade, towards the fighting as the first wave of Richardson's attack. The 88th New York's chaplain, on horseback, rode to the front of the battle line, giving absolution of the Catholic Church to the brigade as they marched forward. They would stop in front of the sunken road and begin to fire back and forth with the Confederate defenders, even General Marr being wounded in the chaos of the fighting. However, Richardson had ordered General Caldwell's brigade forward to help the embattled Irish, but they had never come. He rode to the position to find the brigade sitting idle. Furious, Richardson demanded to know where Caldwell was, to discover from his aide that Caldwell was hiding behind a haystack. Richardson then decided to lead the brigade himself. The Irish withdrew, losing 540 men, as Caldwell's brigade came forward, and the battle began to change in favor of the assaulting Union. Multiple Confederate officers were either dead or wounded, and now with Caldwell's brigade moving forward and crushing the right flank of the Southerners, they began to enfilade fire into the Confederate position. General Rhodes's commands were misunderstood, and the Confederate line began to withdraw from the sunken road, and withdraw back towards the town of Sharpsburg. The Union troops, with their hopes, began to advance after the Confederates, but due to the defensive fire and artillery strikes near the Hagerstown Road, Richardson ordered his men to hold north of the sunken road, using it as cover from the rifle and artillery fire. While directing artillery, however, Richardson would be struck by an artillery shell, which he would later die from, November 2nd, 1862. From 9:30 a.m. to 1 o'clock p.m., 5,600 men had lost their lives assaulting and defending the sunken road, which would lose its name, forever being changed to the Bloody Lane. McClellan, noticing the amassing of troops on the north and reinforcing of the Confederate center, he came to the realization that the southern flank must have had nothing defending it. And he was not wrong. Only two Confederate divisions commanded by General David R. Jones and John G. Walker stood across Antietam Creek from the full might of General Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps of 12,500 men. McClellan directed Burnside to make the advance in order to correlate with Hooker's attack in the north. But unfortunately, the orders would be confused, and Burnside would not begin his advance until after 10 o'clock a.m. After Hooker's assault had concluded, and in the middle of the fighting in the Bloody Lane. Only 200 men commanded by General Robert Toombs was facing off against Burnside across Rohrbach's Bridge, which on paper looked simple. However, the 100-foot bluff and commanding high ground over the bridge proved to be Burnside's undoing as he committed his corps forward. General Sturge's division was directed to cross the bridge and face off with the, in quote, insufficient defenders, while two other divisions would move south and ford the river. The Ohio Brigade, led by Lieutenant Colonel Cook, would be the first to begin the crossing of the bridge. His first regiment, a Connecticut regiment, would be massacred by the entrenched Confederates, forcing them to withdraw. The rest of Cook's brigade began to engage with Confederates on the opposite side of the bank and did not reach the bridge. Burnside, seeing no counterattack from his other two divisions, directed General Sturgis to commit his entire division to take the bridge. Much like the Connecticut regiment, they began to fall victim to artillery and the 400 men deployed across the 100-foot bluff, tearing the division apart and soon making them withdraw as well from attempting to take the bridge. As the morning turned to afternoon, McClellan was furious and put pressure on Burnside to take the position. He sent his inspector general to order Burnside forward. The officer was shocked upon arriving to the scene, the losses at the bridge, and Burnside responded, "McClellan appears to think I am not trying my best to carry this bridge. You are the third or fourth one who has been to me this morning with similar orders." At 12:30 p.m., Sturgis sent his New York Brigade into action across the bridge. This time, however, the Confederates let loose canister into the Federal assault, tearing into the ranks. However, it's at this time that Toombs was informed that elements of Burnside's corps were crossing south at the ford and were about to flank them, so he began to withdraw from the fight. Though now unimpeded, Burnside was delayed 2 hours in continuing his advance due to the ball-necking nature of the bridge. This 2 hours gave Lee the time to move men from the northern part of the field south to engage the oncoming division of General Rodman and Scammon. At 3:30 p.m., the advancing Union troops clashed with men of General A.P. Hill's division that had been waiting for the arrival of the division. Fighting continued for an hour across the whole front, and Burnside felt he would succeed. He simply needed reinforcements and artillery support. But McClellan refused, stating he had no infantry to spare, which was 100% his caution getting the best of him. Sitting in reserve was the entirety of the Union 5th Corps and 6th Corps, who had zero combat the entire day. But as the clock struck 5:30 p.m., fighting across the field had fallen silent. Burnside had lost 20% of his corps, and Rohrbach's Bridge would no longer be known by its name, but as Burnside's Bridge. McClellan decided not to engage in any further fighting the next day, and instead the Union and Confederate armies would clean the field together, collecting their wounded and dead. The next day, Lee would begin his withdrawal back south of the Potomac River and into the safety of Virginia. The battle had caused over 32,700 casualties and would be known as the bloodiest day in American history and in the American Civil War. Though the battle being viewed as a draw, the Northern press was able to spin it as if the Union Army had chased the Southern invaders out of the North. Using this, the President, Abraham Lincoln, would decree the Emancipation Proclamation, officially making the end of slavery part of the Northern war goals. In the South, Lee was applauded for tactically holding off the significantly larger federal force and then being able to return to the South without his army being destroyed. In the North, this would be the final straw with President Lincoln and General McClellan's relationship. Lincoln was exhausted with McClellan's caution and refusal to attack. Famously, Lincoln would say, "If General McClellan is not going to use his army, I would like to borrow it for some time." McClellan would be replaced by Ambrose Burnside, and he would lead the Union Army to the Battle of Fredericksburg and his own removal from command. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed it. Believe me, I am more than well aware yesterday was the anniversary of the battle, but I released my reactions on Sundays, so I didn't want to put up two videos on the same day. It's a little oversaturation in my opinion. If you enjoyed the content, please like, share, and comment. And if you are a returning viewer or new viewer, I invite you to please subscribe to the channel and join this growing community. Thanks for joining us, and see you in the next one.